Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Rosenbaum, a research coordinator on IPA's Global Research and Data Support team. I'll be moderating this webinar. Before we get started with the presentation, I want to let everybody know that there'll be time for a Q&A at the end of the session with all of our panelists. At any time, you can send your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. The webinar will also be being recorded and will be accessible after the session finishes. Today, I'm going to start with a quick discussion of who IPA is and then what our panelists will cover. So as I'm sure many of you know, IPA is a global nonprofit research organization with offices in 22 countries. Our goal is to generate evidence about what types of interventions work and which don't, and to support evidence-informed decision-making. Since our founding in 2002, IPA has worked with over 850 leading academics to complete more than 650 evaluations in 51 countries. This research has informed hundreds of successful programs that now impact millions of individuals worldwide. The findings presented today are the result of a close collaboration between IPA and Northwestern University's Global Poverty Research Lab on the research methods that underlie these studies. IPA partners with academics and decision makers, nonprofits and governments, and together we identify pressing issues, for example, over-indebtedness among consumers. Then we identify potential solutions and we evaluate those solutions to figure out why they work and what works. To do this, we mostly use randomized control trials, which is the same rigorous method that is used in the health field to assess the effectiveness of medicine. Today, we're fortunate to have what I consider an all-star panel to discuss how phone survey protocols and methodology allow us to understand and reach the populations that IPA works with. It provides unique evidence about the effectiveness of random digit dial surveys, RDD, and their protocols, and as well as providing some insight into what researchers can control about who and how many people respond to this new reality of remote survey modes. Andrew Dillon is an associate professor of development economics at Kellogg School of Management. He'll start by contextualizing why, although underlooked, research on research is really fundamental to make effective decisions on how to design and implement research. Shana Warren will follow Andrew and describe a few selected results of IPA's research on phone survey protocols that IPA conducted as part of our RECOVR surveys. Shana is a research scientist on IPA's Path to Scale research team. Then we'll dive into two motivating examples of how specific RECOVR surveys tailored their surveying protocols to respond to challenges with remote surveys during the start of the pandemic. Cosma Gabaglio will present first. He's a research manager at IPA Mexico. He will describe how IPA Mexico used pre-survey messaging experiments to allow them to reach a larger number of potential respondents. Laura Polanco is a research assistant at the IPA's office in the Dominican Republic, and Margarita Cabra is a senior research associate at IPA Colombia's IPA's Colombia office. They'll both describe challenges faced by IPA Colombia and how a combination of experimental and non-experimental protocol changes allowed the RECOVR survey to retain respondents over 6 months. Finally, we'll all discuss how these findings change our understanding of phone survey methods, especially in low and medium income countries, and what role phone survey methods can play both as the pandemic continues and after it ends. With that, I'll pass it to Andrew.
Thanks, Michael. Let me go ahead and share my screen, which is always the most challenging part of any webinar experience. Can everybody see my screen now? Awesome. So thanks, Michael, and thanks to IPA. I'm really excited about this webinar this morning because we're starting to learn some things about phone survey research methods that have been so critical during this pandemic period to inform policy and to continue important work in other research domains that's needed to continue during the pandemic to kind of inform other types of policy other than COVID policy. And so this research and this learning about phone survey methods has really been possible because of IPA's kind of strategic objective to learn and understand about research methods in general, but also because of a really interesting partnership between Northwestern and the Global Poverty Research Lab and IPA on research methods in general. And the purpose of this research methods initiative has been to help provide evidence about the design choices that a lot of researchers and policymakers face when they want to generate evidence. So we want to know and understand the trade-offs we face to have more informed design choices, with the ultimate goal that we would like data collection teams to be able to improve survey data quality. Because we think bad data produces weak evidence. So if we care about measurement error, or if we care about coverage biases, understanding research methods that minimize measurement error or minimize coverage biases can be important to generate stronger evidence about COVID policies. And this was the context in which these RECOVR surveys were conducted. So in general, this research methods initiative, in addition to doing work on phone survey methods, is focused on a broader methodological design of research. We have 3 research themes around research design, so innovations on randomized control trials. A second theme on questionnaire design and measurement, which these phone survey research falls under. And also a third theme on field implementation and data quality, which this phone survey research method also falls under. So just so you know, if you're interested in doing these types of methodological studies in the future, either as part of your organizational functioning or as part of your research, in addition to doing these kind of broad scale surveys that we've done, like the RECOVR surveys, IPA also has a small competitive grants window for research methods work. And we also have a research methods conference that we're hoping to hold at least partially in person this fall at Northwestern University. So I invite you to check out IPA's website and GPRL's website to learn more about those opportunities to do more methodological work in the future. But the exciting thing about this methodological work, especially in the context of these recovery surveys, is that it provided us an opportunity and a way to pivot during the COVID crisis when we couldn't do face-to-face interviewing. And so we think in general, one of the objectives of policy-based research is to maximize the knowledge we can produce by the data that we collect. So we want to produce causal estimates. So those are questions around internal validity, for example, of research data. We want to know that the data that we collect has a high probability of actually estimating the true effect of some policy or intervention. So that's the idea of statistical power in the statistical literature and the research literature. And we want our results to be generalizable. So this is the idea of external validity in kind of the research literature. So those are our goals when we collect data, but we also face constraints. So we don't have unlimited budgets, and also some of the choices we make, either with their questionnaire design or the way we implement the survey, the mode of the survey, for example, doing something in face-to-face versus a telephone survey, can affect data quality. And so what we want to do is we don't want to make these choices blindly in generating data, but we want to have informed design choices to understand what these trade-offs are between high-quality data and how different choices may actually maximize the knowledge that we produce from different surveys. So sometimes people think that methodological work is maybe too technical or maybe a little bit wonky, but it's actually the bread and butter of the way we design and the way we create evidence for policymaking. And we've seen during the COVID crisis that by investing in research methods, we've been able to pivot in a way that we couldn't if we didn't have some understanding or some sort of research methods in place to leverage this type of learning. So in the particular context of these RECOVR surveys, in particular context of using phone surveys to learn during the COVID response, we wanted to offer researchers an opportunity to collect high quality data, even in a phone survey mode, and also reduce budget constraints. But we had some questions about how to implement phone surveys and what the consequences would be on data. One is related to the productivity of the survey. So if phone surveys generally have lower response rates than in-person surveys. So what kind of protocols could we put in place to actually increase response rates? Secondly, because response rates tend to be lower in telephone surveys, would any of these protocols that we put in place to increase response rates actually affect sample composition? So here we're very concerned about generating evidence that's representative of the population that we'd like to describe. So do any of these protocols, for example, help us to ensure that we have good gender balance in our samples, or age balance, educational or occupational balance? So these are going to affect the results that we report to policymakers. So if we have very low response rates for populations that aren't representative of the general population, then we could be giving biased or weak evidence to policymakers. And lastly, there's this issue of data quality that we wanted to address. So can interviewers actually elicit accurate responses over the telephone? In a person-to-person context, there's a social interaction that's resulted and that comes about from a conversation between two people in person. And that itself may have different types of biases, but the anonymity of the phone mode may cause concerns about people maybe to not truthfully report on certain statistics or certain questions because they're not in person with someone. And they may feel either less trusting of the enumerator, or they may just feel less comfortable that their information may be used in some way that maybe they wouldn't like. So data quality is really central to this idea of using phone surveys and understanding phone surveys. So here's what we did. So in 2020, IPA collected about 70 phone surveys throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And what we wanted to do was to somewhat standardize across countries protocols, and to put protocols in place to have systematic learning about these issues of representativeness, about response rates and productivity, and about data quality. And so to do that, we implemented some standardization across surveys, including using things like pre-survey SMS messaging to test different ways and different types of messages and different strategies to contact respondents to try to increase response rates through SMS messaging. I'll tell you a little bit about that in the upcoming presentations. We also varied protocols, and we looked at how representativeness and response rates were affected by days and timing of calls, about protocols like rescheduling calls, and about the maximum number of attempts to actually try to get a respondent to complete a survey. And so these were some of the pre-survey interventions and some of the protocols that we used to try to learn more about what the trade-offs would be on data quality, representativeness, and response rates. So in each of our surveys, we recorded data that recorded each call separately, and we had a system of standardization so we could understand completion rates and the anatomy of a response, because there's at different points in which a respondent could drop off the call. And so we wanted to understand how that process worked to get someone to complete a survey. So we standardized those outcomes for calls across these 70 surveys. And we also put in place an interviewer survey so we could understand the characteristics of the people who are making these calls. So even though in a telephone survey context, someone may not be face-to-face with their respondent, there's still a social interaction going on over the telephone. And so an interviewer's skills to put someone at ease, or the way they explain different types of questions, may affect the quality of responses. And so we wanted to understand something more about the interviewers and have characteristics about them that would also inform our understanding about the effectiveness of these different protocols. So with that, that gives you a little bit of an overview of the Research Methods Initiative and why we're doing this methodological work on telephone surveys. I'm excited to share with you the rest of the panel. So Shana, Laura, Margarita, and Michael are going to share some specific examples from their work in the RECOVR surveys in general, and from Mexico, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic, to share with you a little bit about the lessons that we've learned from this approach of methodological research on telephone surveys. Thanks.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your time zone, everyone. My name is Shana Warren. I am a research scientist at IPA on the Path to Scale research team, as Michael mentioned. I was also one of the co-PIs for IPA's RECOVR effort, which was our multi-country COVID response surveys that we ran throughout 2020. These are all phone surveys using random digit dialing, and today I'm going to talk about some of the lessons we learned that way. Next. Okay. So in 2020, IPA launched these surveys across 10 countries, and as Andrew mentioned, we collected a standard set of data about the process and protocols. Today, as you see in the little green question mark box, I am going to address what types of protocols can increase survey response rates and productivity. But we looked also at attention and duration and how those might affect response quality, the representativeness of phone surveys, whether we could do some skills measurement remotely, and how interviewer skills affect surveying success and data quality. All of those things will be upcoming from IPA. Next. So when we think about a survey and the response process, we imagine, as you do random digit dialing, first you need to get someone to pick up their phone, for which they need to be inside a coverage area, it needs to be charged, it needs to be on. Then, and the person needs to be available and choose to pick it up. We then need to go through the screening process. For example, in the RECOVR surveys, we required respondents be over 18 years old. Then the respondent actually needs to be available for the duration of a survey. And availability, when you're talking about mobile phones, may also include things like, does the phone have sufficient battery charge? Is the person in a place that is quiet enough that they can take a call? Okay. Then you need to be able to get their consent. And finally, once someone initiates the survey with you, you need to finalize it. Okay. This leaves many opportunities for potential respondents to fail to become actual respondents. Next. Okay. So the first thing we find is that while response rates vary by country, so here are a series of RECOVR countries, but the largest drop-offs are in getting respondents to pick up calls and then getting them to begin the survey in the first place. As you can see on the far right of the graph, once we get to start the survey versus complete, the graph is nearly flat. And this is because once people start the survey, they almost always complete. Okay. So efforts, what do we learn here? First, efforts to improve response rates should focus on getting people to respond to the call in the first place and begin the survey. We see there's a very large drop-off between establishing that we have a working number and actually successfully making contact. That's sort of the steepest slope in this graph. One option to increase the probability that people will respond to your survey is to reach out by text message. Next slide. So how could a pre-survey SMS impact response rates? Well, first, it could directly impact 2 points when potential respondents fail to convert to actual respondents. First, it could affect pickup, and it could also affect the consent process. So a pre-survey SMS alerts a potential respondent to the nature of the call before they pick up the phone. Okay. This could encourage some people to pick up the phone. It could also discourage some people from picking up the phone. Okay. A pre-survey SMS may also encourage respondents to consent to a survey by allowing them to think about the benefits of participation ahead of time, rather than sort of catching them off guard. So we implement some experiments to sort of dig into this. Next. Okay. So what are possible impacts of SMS on response rates? So what I show here, the blue and the gray on the far left show that there is some proportion of people who will answer a call or not answer it if there's no SMS ahead of time. Of those who answer, those in green might complete the survey, and those in gray might refuse or drop the call. This is sort of a simplified version. Next panel. You could send an SMS and you could cause a conversion of refusals. That is, by sending an SMS ahead of time, potential respondents could change their choice. It could increase their trust or interest so that the respondent is more likely to consent And as we saw earlier, once respondents consent, they almost always complete the survey. So you could convert some refusals this way. Final column. So you could also see a world in which someone uses SMS to screen calls. And there could be a few affected groups. There are those that wouldn't have answered the phone, but wouldn't consent, that now know not to pick up the phone. So there are people who might have picked up, but would never have said yes, and they might not pick it up. Okay. Then there are those that wouldn't have picked up the phone, but would complete the survey if they had. These are the people on the bottom, the no answer group. They now might make the choice to both answer the call and complete the survey. So those are the people that have converted from blue to green on the bottom. But the worry is that we could lose response rates if there are respondents who would have taken the survey had you caught them on the phone, but now screen out the call entirely. Okay. So we see in the sort of the top, that answer box has shrunk down. So there could be people who just don't pick up now that they know what it's about. So we need to run an experiment to sort of understand what the options are, because all of these are possible. Next. Yeah. So here we provide a simple example of a pre-survey SMS message. So this includes branding, information, motivation to take the survey. So hello, I'm from IPA, an international NGO that discovers and promotes effective solutions to global poverty problems. Okay, now you know who I am and why I'm calling. In the coming days, we may call you to conduct a survey. Now we're letting people know. And then we flagged to help researchers. So we went through many different models of this. In some cases, it was about researchers or to help the government understand the dynamics of COVID. So we could change the potential motivation. And then finally, we add additional branding, and we understand that in many countries, people are using smartphones and might want a link they could click on to establish that this is genuine, especially given, of course, the prevalence of scams. Okay? So the content is full of moving parts. We provide information to help people make decisions. We build trust through branding and mission alignment, and we encourage people to help in a national emergency by triggering social responsibility or intellectual interest. So we can vary that final part. Next. All right. So how do we do this? We randomly assign numbers to receive an SMS or not and try to increase response rates. What is very convenient about random digit dial is that, in fact, all of this is random. The numbers are already random. So when you receive a set of numbers for random digit dial, and IPA has worked with a company that sort of pre-pings the numbers so we know they're real and they do work. This goes on out of sight. This is a technological approach. Respondents have not received a ping or anything ahead of time. So when you receive these numbers, you know nothing about them. So you don't have to worry as much about random assignment because we actually have no covariates at all. So we use 3 different designs that all of which give some portion of the sample SMS and some a control condition. So for example, in Mexico City, 25% of our sample got a recommendation that this would help government, 25% heard that this could help researchers, and 50% said received no SMS. I'll also note here that Mexico is an exceptional case. In almost all countries, there is no area code that gives you any geographic information with mobile phones, but Mexico is the exception there. And in Mexico, you can target specific states. Should anyone be planning an RDD survey in Mexico in particular? Okay. As you can see, depending on the country we're in, we varied the pattern of treatment assignment differently. In some cases, we just gave more information about the survey. In the Philippines, at one point, we provided information about what the survey incentive payment would be, just to see where we might go. Next slide, and I'll talk about the results. Okay. So the pre-survey SMS might increase response rates. Okay. So first, we can see there was a potential this might happen, but if you look across at pickups, we're not seeing a significant effect anywhere except in the Philippines, where we do see a drop in the information treatment that is statistically significant of about 4.5 percentage points in response rates. So maybe this wasn't the best strategy. But next row, when we look at completions, which is really what we care about in these surveys, we see that typically a pre-survey SMS does increase the probability that an initiated call will result in a completed survey. This is not true across the board. It was not the case in the Philippines. And we see even within individual countries, such as Colombia, where we tested both a helping researchers and helping government message, that there were some differences. All of this to say that when you are planning this for your own surveys, you should consider how this might work in your particular context, and I would strongly recommend piloting it in your particular case. Okay. Next slide. So how could the number of call attempts affect response rates? So this is another choice you have in the protocol of your survey. Do you call each number once and move on? Do you call a single number multiple times? Okay. So the number of call effects could affect whether somebody picks up and also if they're available. Maybe the first time you call is just a bad time for the respondent. They're on the bus, they are cooking dinner, they're at work, all sorts of reasons. Next slide. So what we find overall, so the dotted line here is call pickups and the solid line is completed calls. So each attempt beyond the first produces a steep drop off in the share of calls even picked up. So productivity declines, and this affects what it will cost you to do your survey. And I will say it also affects how it feels for an enumerator to do this job, right? Having a lot of non-response is challenging for enumerators, okay? But the decline in the share that completes the call, looking at the solid line, declines far less rapidly, okay? So overall, the protocol to maximize productivity would be to make a single attempt and then move on. But we do wonder how this might affect the composition of your sample. Maybe people who pick up the very first time they receive a call are systematically different from those who need multiple calls to pick up. So that's the next question in our research that I'd like to discuss today. Next slide. Okay. So what we learn overall is that what we do is we categorize respondents into those that answered on the first attempt versus those that answered on the second or third or fourth or fifth call. Okay. So first of all, what we learn is that there are some differences. The only one that was consistent across samples, and again, this is pooled, there is variation within samples. The consistent finding was that multiple attempts will yield more respondents who are employed. And this isn't terribly surprising since people who are employed may be busier and less likely to be able to pick up to your call at a particular moment. We find that the probability of being in poverty also declines with multiple attempts. So it's not statistically significant in the pooled sample, but it is in some smaller samples. Okay. Education, interestingly, varied in sign. So here it looks like a 0, but what it actually is highly variable between countries. So in Ghana and Uganda, subsequent attempts, you were less likely to get people with at least a secondary education. In Rwanda, additional attempts got you more and more educated sample. So all of this tells you that additional attempts do alter sample composition, but exactly how varies by content. And so when you are designing an RDD survey, you need to consider how these factors play out in your particular context and which is important to you. I would consistently recommend that everyone track as you're doing your survey what the difference is, for example, between people who respond to the first call and subsequent calls on key demographic covariates that are important to your research. So let's move on to key takeaways so that you can then delve into some specific country details from Margarita and Laura and Cosma. So first, key takeaway. We have some optimism that SMS messaging may increase response rates, and our preliminary analysis shows that this is not affecting sample composition. This is also nice because SMS messaging is relatively inexpensive, under $100 for 1,000 or 2,000 SMS in most contexts. And when I say SMS, depending on the context, you could consider using WhatsApp. Okay. Next, additional attempts do produce a sample with different observable characteristics, but they are reducing enumerator productivity. So there is a trade-off between productivity and therefore cost and sample characteristics. Finally, there's a lot of questions that remain. So are these results similar with different forms of sample recruitment? During the context of COVID, were things different? We know many more people were home, for example, and many more people really cared about helping government respond to this crisis, or researchers. And then how is data quality affected is something we and others are still working on. Next slide. So if you'd like more information on this, IPA has put together a series of methods notes. We summarize these results as part of the GPRL working paper series, and they're stored on the Social Science Research Network. And you'll be able to access the links through the final slides. Next. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. And I will pass the baton.
Cosma, are you able to share?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Cosma Gaballo. I'm research manager here at IPA Mexico. And I will talk on the data collection for the RECOVR project here in Mexico, and especially on our main issue that has been extremely low response rate. But I will also talk about our countermeasures, including pre-survey notifications. So this was the first time that IPA was conducting data collection based on RDD here in Mexico. So we couldn't find really reliable estimates to understand how the response rate would be. And what we did was to base ourselves on the experience of other countries that had been running the RECOVR survey before us. Unfortunately, as you can see, the response rate was extremely low. So only about 4.2% of attempts resulted in completion. So we don't have a definitive answer as to what was the reason, but the hypothesis refer to general mistrust of the population here in Mexico towards calls from unknown numbers, and in general to sharing information on the phone. We do know something about consequences though. So there was an increase in costs and there was an extended timeline. And at the time, we were in a rush to provide some useful data to the government to make decisions. There was also an impact on the quality of the work by enumerators. So as Shanna mentioned, it's incredibly difficult to maintain motivation in the enumerators with such low response rates. Another important aspect is that there are outstanding questions about sample composition. This was also mentioned. At such low response rates, it's possible that the people answering differ in some significant way to the people not answering. So the question is, you've already started a data collection on the phone and you discover that the response rate is way lower than what you had planned. What can you do? In our case, what we did was to try using all levers that were available at the moment, which meant modifying the protocols on the go. On pre-survey contact, as Shanna mentioned, from the beginning we had been running an experiment on the impact of sending SMS to potential respondents. On number of attempts, initially the protocol was to call each number multiple times over multiple days, but as soon as we realized that each attempt would actually have a lower probability of getting a survey, we decided to tell enumerators to be free to change number after the first attempt, unless the respondent actually picked up and asked to call at another time. Then there were changes on enumerator staffing. We increased the team size, and we also increased the payment per survey. To counterbalance that, we also increased the number of surveys that we were auditing using audio recording. And finally, so we actually tried to speed up the process of calling. What about the experiment with SMS? So as Shanna mentioned, at the beginning, the structure was the following. 50% of the sample was assigned to receive no SMS, 25% was assigned to receive this SMS mentioning how the data would be used by researchers, and 25% of the sample would receive a message about how the government would be using this information. So after a few days, it was already apparent that we had a big trouble with response rate. And after about 1 week, we started to have doubts that the SMS was actually working. So given the special situation and the need to readapt everything, we decided to redesign the experiment in an adaptive way that could be useful for the data collection itself. So what we did was to, the first tranche of the design was to split in 4 treatments and control: no SMS, government, and also mentioning the incentive that at the time was $1.5 in phone recharge. Then another version mentioning that we, IPA, was in partnership with the government. And finally, a combination of the two. The plan, so the structure of the adaptive experiment, was to programmatically readapt after 2 days. So after 2 days, we would choose the 2 treatments that were most effective, or seemed to be most effective. In our case, government and incentive, and partnership and incentive. And after 2 more days, we would actually settle for the treatment that was most effective in increasing the response rate. This last version actually wasn't implemented because the data collection had been completed already. What about results? So what you can see here is that the probability that each case would result in a complete survey. As you can see in the first phase of the data collection, sending a message was increasing the likelihood of completing a survey by more than 1 percentage point. That sounds really low, but in our context of extremely low response rate was about 25%. This was sustained in the second part of the experiment, so tranche 2, but we couldn't really detect differences, significant difference in the content of the message. This might due to smaller sample size of the second part of the experiment. What about sample composition? So this is a very important topic and very broad in the discussion of RDD in general. One narrower question regarding our experiment is whether SMS in itself impacts sample composition and whether the content of the SMS matters. So in our case, there are no detectable differences in sample composition among the first set of SMS, and we don't have really enough statistical power to detect differences among the second set of messages. So some final words on lesson learned. So protocols matter, but then in the situation of data collection, you might be forced to change things. What is important is always to think through the implications of the changes that you are doing, and as Shanna mentioned, also to actually document what you have been doing and track how this impacts your sample composition. In our context, sending SMS has been very effective, and also there were no substantive changes that we could detect in the sample composition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cosmo. Margarita, I believe you're still on.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everybody. We are now going to present the lessons learned from RECOVR's survey in Colombia. We implemented the last year in 3 rounds. The first one was in May, the second one was in August, and the third one was in November. And as we couldn't replace readers over the 6 months, we ran them, make sure that and the second one, the survey, so many responding in the 3 protocols or strategies. We leave you with Laura Polanco, colleague, so she can explain how which protocols we implemented in Colombia.
Thank you, Margarita. Hello, everybody. Let's start talking about the protocols of this project. We developed important field protocols for each round, taking into consideration that every round has its similarities and differences. So for the first round, we set a goal of completing 1,300 surveys in 7 days of data collection. We used the following field protocols to accomplish this goal. First, we sent a pre-survey SMS the day before starting the data collection. Also, the numerators had a limit of 4 attempts per phone number. If they did not get an answer on the first one, they had to call at different times of the day. In addition to this, we use a real-time tool that allows us to constantly monitor whether the numerators were depleting the sample quicker than expected or still have phone numbers to call. For the second round, we had different goals related to the response rate. We wanted the highest response rate possible, so we implemented a series of measures to ensure we tried our best to contact all the participants. Also, we had to ensure to correctly implement the different treatments we had. First, we sent a pre-survey SMS to all the participants a day before the beginning of the data collection, aiming to increase confidence. Second, we changed the number of attempts before closing a case without response to 8 times per phone number. Enumerators had to make these call attempts on different days and different time blocks. We increased this number to 9 attempts during the last 2 days of the data collection. There, the enumerators used IPA's logo as a profile picture in WhatsApp and added information about the project on their WhatsApp status on the cell phone they used to call the participants. Furthermore, we sent an additional SMS and voicemail to the people who had not responded to the survey yet to remind to them we had the first survey in May and we would contact them in the following days for a follow-up one. We did this only after confirming this would not bias the sample. Additionally, we look at the hours and days respondents answered the first round, as we could have a greater opportunity to reach them at the same schedule. Now, Margarita will continue talking about the protocols of the round 3.
Okay, thank you, Laura. On the round 3, what we did was adding an extra SMS between round 2 and round 3, where we remember the participants that we wanted to call them again to continue with the study. Furthermore, we decreased the number of attempts on the third round to 6, from 8 to 6, to increase the productivity of the enumerators. But what we did here to try to reach as many participants as we could was having 2 groups of enumerators. The first one would work for 6 days, and it would be a big group of enumerators. And the second one would work just 3 days, but we selected the 5 best, the best enumerators to work for these days and to call just to the numbers that we couldn't reach until the moment. Additionally, we wanted to send the voicemail, but this time not just for the remaining part of the participants that we had in round 2, but we decided to do it for every time from the beginning, for every time that we got, for every case, the first time that we got voicemail, sorry, we send a voicemail remembering or trying to convince them to participate. We also implemented some graphs where we could see the time use of the numerators to see how do they invest their time to follow up with the protocols and fulfill so many surveys as they could. But there was a problem, or not a problem, but protocols have some constraint, and is that we cannot control everything that is happening over on the field. For example, we don't know whether the participant is going to be available the first time that we, or the first attempt that we do the call, or for example, as well, that if the numbers, the phone numbers are still available or active across the rounds. Here we can see the dashed lines that are the pickup. This is the pickup rate for the first round that we had an RDD, of course, new participants that we didn't know anything about there. And the continue line shows us the percentage of completed surveys on every attempt. So we can see that for the RDD, the new sample, we got around 20% of completed surveys in the first, second, and the third call attempt. On the second and the third round, that it was more difficult because we have to recontact those people from the first round. What we did, what we can see is that the pickup rate, even if it is higher, because we sent all of this SMS, remembering, and and all of these protocols that already we talked in the last slide, in the previous slide, it was decreasing, but we can see here that on the completed survey, percentage of survey completed by attempt, we can see that it stabilizes on the fourth and the fifth call attempt. Therefore, as we already commented, we set it up in the third round to diminish or decrease the number of attempts to 6, from 8 to 6, and have a second group to recall those numbers, and therefore it increased the completion rate on the last attempts that we tried to do.
Even using all these protocols, loss of sample was a constant problem. Fortunately, in the case of Colombia, the loss of respondents was not associated with changes in the observed characteristics of the sample. As you can see on this graph, poverty rate, measured using the Poverty Probability Index, employment rate, gender, and education level did not suffer significant changes through the different rounds despite the loss of respondents.
Okay, and finally, it's not just the protocols what we implemented to try to reduce the attrition rate. We also implemented some questionnaire design techniques for shorten the survey as much as possible. And what we learned from here is that sometimes when we want to ask some of the sections, we want to prioritize information about some specific household members, and therefore it's important to ask or to include, or we can advise to include a household roster from the baseline, to use the household membership data in later rounds, and so we don't have to ask them in the follow-ups, and therefore we can prioritize the information that we need. For example, If we know that for the income section, we need, or it is more important for us, for our study, to include the information of the head of the household, then we just ask this information for the head of the household. If we don't know which member we should prioritize, we can randomly choose any household member. For example, for the education section, if there is a big household, there is a big household with many children, we can just randomly choose one and make them the questions about that about that child. And also we can just partially randomly take someone. For example, in the case that we want to, in the income section, we just want to know the information about one person in the household who had a job previously from the pandemic. So the important thing here is try to reduce the length of the survey to reduce attrition. And finally, on the lessons learned that, from Colombia, is that it's inevitable to have a loss of respondents in RDD surveys, but and we know that people, for example, get tired from answering these surveys if we do many follow-ups. So we have to try to reduce the length of the survey. We also can use incentives for motivate them to participate. And we don't know if the number is going to be active during the whole year or the time of the study.
And as a final lesson learned, we want to mention that every technique used to mitigate this loss of respondents will have an associated cost. Each technique should be assessed before implemented, and if the costs and disadvantages are few and there's evidence that they will not reduce the response rate, then it may be a good idea to implement it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you all for sharing such insightful presentations. I think we still have a few minutes left to do a quick Q&A with some of the questions that we've received in the chat and in the registration link. So I'll start with, I believe you're still sharing your screen, Margarita. I'll start with one question for all of you that we received in the survey registration. We received a question about what do we need to learn more about to be effective in conducting random digit dial surveys and generating samples over the phone. And this also includes more than just what the data is telling us, but what anecdotal feedback have we received that we would suggest that specific learnings are high priority?
I'd be happy to answer that question. So from my personal perspective as a researcher, I would say that a top priority question to answer is how representative a random digit dial survey is. And I want to separate the idea of a phone survey from a random digit dial survey, because a phone survey encompasses many other types. It's very different making a phone call to follow up on an existing sample where you have an established relationship with the respondent and you know who you're calling and already know information about them than an RDD survey. But I think understanding the representativeness of RDD surveys and both benefits and limitations, and I think this showed up in some of the Q&A as well, that it really depends on who you're trying to reach, right? If you are trying to reach the poorest of the poor who may not own phones, then an RDD survey is not the way you want to go, for example. If you want to gain information very rapidly from a broad swath of the population, as we did in the case of RECOVR, it might be more advisable. And I will pass on to others and not take all the time.
I'm going to, unfortunately, pick some people. I know, Cosmo, we've talked a little bit about internally about what we need to know more about for these RDD samples, especially in places where we have low response rates. Could you weigh in a little bit on response rate difficulty?
Sure, I will be a bit repetitive in the sense that I share Shena's view that this is the main open question, and maybe specify that this question combined with the question of really low response rates is almost a different type of question. No? So what you saw in Shena's presentation of trying to see how number of attempts changes or doesn't change the sample, this is a very big question that in our case in Mexico, we weren't able to really answer before completing the data collection. But I think that this sort of iterative effort is important for us to gain knowledge in the future and be more ready in next future data collections.
I'm going to ask Andrew to weigh in a little bit here. Much of the evidence we've heard today has been from our Latin American surveys, but Andrew, a lot of your research is in Francophone West Africa. Is there specific learnings that would be useful for that context?
Well, I think what we're seeing from some of the telephone survey work is that, obviously access to mobile phones can be something that limits representativeness. So that's something I think we need to pay attention to going into the future. And certainly in countries that have lower mobile phone access, then that representativity issue is more exacerbated. And I think this is where there's also concerns related to gender, is because in a lot of lower mobile phone access countries, households may have one phone that they share amongst multiple people. And then the question of who answers the phone becomes really important. And so one of the broader issues I think we need to explore going forward with phone surveys, especially those that are RDD surveys, are around questionnaire design. So we know from the face-to-face household survey literature that different respondents will answer questions in different ways and have different impressions about household statistics. And so I think, going forward, we need to think about who the respondents are and what types of biases there may be in those respondents' answers for the household or for other members of their household. But then as a second questionnaire design issue, I also think we need to consider carefully the type of variables that we can collect with household phone survey data in general versus those we can collect in person. So detailed individual level information is harder to get on phone surveys because it takes more time, right? And you have a lower amount of time on a phone survey than you might have in a face-to-face interview. Taking information like consumption or income may be more challenging. So there's lots of kind of open questions, I think, apart from the response rates and the representativity issues that relate to questionnaire design. And kind of the universe of variables that could be collected in the survey mode versus others. Because telephone surveys have had such low response rates, the first order question is response rate, right? And representativity. But I think as we move into a world that's more mobily integrated, we need to have a longer term research agenda that focuses not only on response rates, but on questionnaire design for telephone surveys.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a lot of directions of the research that we've been thinking of, and is certainly very exciting. I know, Laura and Margarita, you mentioned a little bit about questionnaire design in the Colombia survey. Do you have any anecdotal feedback from the surveyors about what would be high priority ideas about specific learnings about questionnaires in the Colombian context?
I think that on the side, on the IPV, sometimes it's very important, or the violence questions is very important to be very general and try not to be very specific on the words that you include in the questions. For example, having answers like yes, no on this type of, let's say, this question, these very sensitive questions, it's very important, or just say for the answers. It increased, decreased, but not having an answer like a very specific anecdotal thing is very important. I don't know if that answers one of the questions that we received in the Q&A. And Laura, I don't know if you have another one, anecdotal.
Well, more than well, I just want to say, like to highlight that it's very important on this phone service, the length of the survey while you're doing the questionnaire design. And I want to highlight the roster here and the questions that aim to the roster. I think that in every questionnaire, via phone survey or face-to-face, when a question is very repetitive, the person is going to feel tired and will start to feel tired. So in phone survey, when the respondent has the option to just close the phone so easy, it's very important to avoid a repetitive question if possible.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I realize we're over time right now. There's a number of really good questions. I want to highlight that Shayna has put the methods notes that IPA has conducted in the chat. And I will also copy below a link to IPA and GPRL's phone survey methods site. While we have one more minute of our panelists together, I'm going to ask a lightning round question of if there's one piece of information you could collect before running an RDD survey, what would you need to know before making that decision? Cosmo, could you start?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. If there's one piece of information that you would know before deciding whether to have an RDD survey or not, what would it be?
Oh, definitely. So I'd say it's very important to think through all these things we discussed for the specific question of your research. So all these problems might not be problems depending on the context. And so really important that you go through your specific situation, your population that you want to reach, the availability of cell phones and so on. I think this contextualizing this general information in your specific context is the most important thing.
And Andrew, what information would you need?
Well, I think the results on the pre-messaging SMS messages are really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you see that pre-survey SMS messaging lowers completion rates for some respondents, but increases it for other respondents, right? But the effects are a little small and the magnitudes maybe are a little bit uncertain across context. So I think there's a lot of open questions there because obviously you're bifurcating your sample in different ways, you're splitting your sample. And so I would really like to understand what pre-survey SMS messaging is doing to my sample before I started an RDD survey.
Laura and Margarita, what information about your sample would you need to know? And this will be the last one.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm so sorry, I've made a mess of this. What lesson or what question would you need to have the answer to be able to decide whether to do an RDD survey? What unknown is really high priority to make a decision about whether we should run a survey?
I think it's important to know how fast do you need the information. I think RDDs are very good for that. You can have very easily or very frequently information on that, but then you have to take into account the time between rounds and how and the quality or the design of the questionnaire. That is what I can complement from the others.
Well, I would like to add that it's also important to know if there's significant differences between the people who have a cell phone or a telephone number and the people who have not in that specific country. For example, in the case of Colombia, we didn't have any problem in that specific case, but this could be different in other countries.
And finally, Shana, what question would you like to answer?
I think the question I would most want for more of the countries that we've worked in particular is who has a mobile phone? Like more of the data about who owns phone ownership and coverage areas. And apologies for the child's violin in the background.
Thank you to all of our panelists today for even running a tiny bit over, and thank you to all of the attendees for listening to this. Please feel free to reach out to IPA and GPRL with any questions, and please read the methods notes and the resources that the GPRL IPA partnership has created on phone survey methods on IPA and GPRL sites if you have any remaining questions. I think that's it for us.